Every film industry in India loves to claim it's the heart of Indian cinema. Bollywood says it's the heartbeat. Tollywood flexes as the muscle. Collywood insists it's the backbone. But the brain, that belongs to Kerala. Malayalam cinema today stands as that unassuming kid in class who quietly aces every exam, while the rest of the school fights over who's better at the annual dance competition. When a new Malayalam film drops, Twitter threads appear dissecting its lighting, its subtext, its politics, as if everyone suddenly enrolled in a film study course. Meanwhile, the rest of India stares in awe and occasionally murmurs, how are they doing this on a budget smaller than a Mumbai item number? Here's the irony, while some Hindi superstars, Telugu superstars or Tamil superstars spend 3 or 4 years preparing for a single magnum opus, Kerala's beloved Mohanlal and Mammootty casually do 4 films in a calendar year. And not just 4 films, 4 entirely different lives, and somehow still manage to look like they just walked out of a literature seminar. Mohanlal might do a philosophical fantasy in January, a courtroom drama by April, a family thriller in August, and an experimental myth by December. Mammootty might be a demigod in one film and a vulnerable everyman in another, all before Diwali. And despite a few flops, they are still worshipped. Their fans treat failure as a creative pit stop, not a downfall. Because in Kerala, even flops are post-mortem like PhD thesis. Yes, the film tanked. The screenplay failed to emotionally connect in Act 2. But what an interesting study in lensing, huh? Only in Kerala do people treat flops as learning material. Yet, when you look at Malayalam cinema's present, films like Thudrum, Brahmyugam or Manjumal Boys being discussed by audience across the country, you start to wonder how did this small, rain-soaked coastal industry become the thinking engine of the Indian cinema? Yet for all its intelligence, the Malayalam industry was not always like this. There was a time when it followed the same hero-villain love song template that every other industry in the country lived by. There was melodrama, moral policing and wahi Mooch Humana. Everything except surprise, until fatigue crept in, until a storm called Big B arrived. Hello, this is Aryan and we move on to chapter 1. Once upon a time, there was a hero, a villain and a coconut tree. There was a time when Malayalam cinema followed the exact same playbook as the rest of Indian cinema. A hero who could fight 20 men and still deliver a moral lesson. A heroine whose primary job was to faint elegantly. And a villain whose laugh alone could violate human rights. The 1980s and 90s were the glorious superstar decades. Mammootty and Mohanlal reigned supreme. Their films were larger than life, yet still had a unique Malayali flavor, moral complexity, philosophical undertones, and just enough melodrama to keep everyone happy. Mohanlal could cry, fight, and philosophize in same frame. Mammootty could enter a room, raise one eyebrow, and bring down an empire. Together, they carried the industry on their backs. The generation of Malayalis migrated to the Gulf with cassette tape of Illukam, Kiridam or New Delhi tucked into their luggage. This was the era when the average Malayali filmgoer believed cinema was about masculinity meeting morality. Heroes were flawed yet dignified. Villains were wicked yet poetic. Every mother was long-suffering, every friend was loyal, and every climax ended with someone shouting, Amma! Actors like Mohanlal, Mammootty and Nedumadi Venu carried the industry with sheer charisma. They balanced art house sensitivity and mass appeal like tightrope walkers. But with every new decade, it became harder to tell the difference between one story and the next. It worked for a while, until fatigue crept in. Not in the audience eyes, but in storytelling itself. The repetition, testosterone overdose, the predictable redemption arc, something had to give. And when it did, it wasn't pretty. Chapter 2, The Fatigue and the Sakila Wave. Before the seed could bloom, the industry had to endure a storm. When the audience got tired of mustached moralist and heroic punch dialogues, an unexpected figure emerged, Shakila. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the Malayali audience discovered a different kind of star. Unapologetically female, defiantly sensual and shockingly independent of any male savior. While the rest of the country watched item songs in multiplexes, Kerala was sneaking into single screen to watch Kinnar Thumbikal. Her films were low budget, formulaic but wildly successful. In an ironic twist, the Malayalam film industry survived an economic slump because of a woman who challenged its patriarchal gaze. At one point, more than 70% of Malayalam releases were softcore films, most dubbed and recycled endlessly. The Sakila wave wasn't just about titillation, it symbolized the collapse of the old hero-centric order. The male hero was dethroned. The lens had turned, literally and figuratively. And that shook the moral core of Malayalam cinema because for an industry built on masculine prestige and moral authority, being rescued by softcore cinema felt like a cosmic joke. But it was also a turning point. Beneath the sensationalism, a cultural shift was brewing. The masses were no longer buying recycled morality tales. They wanted something that felt real, something that spoke to their evolving social realities. The superstar films started losing their invincibility. Mohanlal and Mammootty continued delivering blockbuster but also faced flop that would have destroyed lesser mortals. This was the moment when the audience itself began to change and the filmmakers had to evolve or perish. उस टाइम के लिए एक सच तो ये भी है, लो बजट सॉफ्टकोर फीचर्स दैट रैन पैक्ड shows while mainstream cinema gasped for air. Moral purists called it decline, historians later called it transition. The old order crumbled, what remained was confusion. But in that confusion, young filmmakers saw space. They realized the audience had matured. It was time the cinema did too. Chapter 3, The Dubbed Era in the Decline. The Sakila wave was the rebellion, the dubbed film era was the aftermath, the hangover after the party. By the mid 2000s, Tamil and Telugu films were flooding Kerala screens. Slick, stylish, and often louder, they arrived with better marketing, better music, and heroes who looked like they could jump from helicopters while quoting philosophy. Malayalam filmmakers started imitating them, thinking the formula for success was bigger, faster, louder. But what worked for Vijay or Mahesh Babu didn't fit for Mohanlal or Mammootty, whose powers came from nuance, not noise. The local flavor began to fade. Scripts tried to sound massy, dialogues lost their natural rhythm, and somewhere along the line, Malayalam cinema forgot how to sound like itself. It was like watching a friend who once quoted Ilyaraja now trying to rap Eminem. Respectable effort, disastrous execution. But this decline, painful as it was, became necessary because out of that chaos emerged a generation that refused to repeat history. They were young, restless, and broke. And that's how usually revolutions begin. Chapter 4, Rise of the New Generation Movement. The early 2010s, the internet had arrived. Piracy became synonymous with democracy, and YouTube became the new film school. Suddenly, young Malayali filmmakers who grew up on the world cinema and Hollywood screenplays started asking dangerous questions. What if we stop making movies about perfect men and start telling stories about real people? What if we saw Trivandrum's traffic, Kochi's chaos, and Thrissur tea stall without any filters? Huh? What if our heroes are not heroes at all? Huh? Mean? Just humans who mess up, swear, and sometimes do nothing? Nobody knew that it would begin what is now called the New Generation Movement, a cinematic uprising led by directors like Asik Abu, Anwar Raseed, Vineet Srinivasan, and Rajiv Ravi. For this, there came a glimmer of hope named Big B. It was the rebellion in a trench coat. When I first saw Big B, I remember thinking, what on earth is this? A Malayalam film that looks like Hollywood graphic novel. The camera did not just record scenes, it swaggered. The rain felt like a character. Mammootty's walk felt like choreographed by a metronome. And for once, silence spoke louder than background music. Big B broke no box office records when it released, but it broke something else. Complacency. It proved that style could be substance. The Malayali audience were ready for grit, darkness, ambiguity, and yes, swagger. The film rewrote the grammar of Malayalam cinema. It was not about plot, it was about presence. It was the kind of movie that told the next generation, you don't need to copy others, you can build your own genre. The statement made through neon lights and slow motion planted a seed that would later be called the New Generation Movement. They broke rules with surgical precision. They sought handheld, wrote dialogues like real conversations, and scored music that blended Carnatic rag with hip-hop beats. The movement did not arrive with a manifesto. It arrived through whispers, experiments, and failures that refused to fade. Around 2010, a new wave of directors started to make films that sounded like real life and looked like art. Films like Salt and Pepper, 22 Female Kottayam, Bangalore Days, and Premam didn't just carry forward the legacy or entertain. They redefined the Malayali aesthetic. No hero worship, no forced drama, no slow-mo entry in front or fire trucks. Just stories. Messy, awkward, emotional, deeply human. The heroes were no longer saints. They were flawed, confused, funny, vulnerable. The women had agency. The cities were characters. And the audience, long starved of honesty, embraced it. The visual language changed too. Cinematographers like Siju Khalid and Samir Tahir turned natural lights into poetry. Writers stopped sermonizing and started conversing. This moment wasn't born from studios but from struggles. Independent cinema, crowd-funded projects, and friends who mortgaged house to tell stories they believed in. What began with Big B's aesthetics now had a philosophy. Cinema should mirror society, not instruct it. That was the essence of the new generation movement. Malayalam cinema rediscovered its own dialect and suddenly the world took notice. Chapter 5 Duality Realism versus mass, art versus commerce, local versus global. Once that idea took hold, there was no stopping it. Malayalam cinema exploded, quietly, intelligently, beautifully. The success of the new generation era didn't kill the old stars, it challenged them. Mohanlal, Mammootty, and their contemporaries adapted like cinematic chameleons. Suddenly, you had films like Drishyam, which combined thriller pacing with moral complexity. Drishyam proved that mainstream could still be cerebral, a man covering up a crime to save his family. It was Hitchcock by way of Idduki. Then came Jallikattu, which threw dialogue out of the window and replaced it with primal chaos. Watching it felt like attending a ritual, not a movie. It was Kerala's wild scream into the cinematic jungle. Mammootty did Nanpakkal Nerathu Mayakkam, Prenabu and Brahmayugam oscillating between art house brilliance and supernatural experiment. Mohanlal played everything from mythical warriors to fragile man drowning in moral conflict. In any other industry, such reinvention would be unthinkable. Imagine if Shahrukh Khan or Rajnikant did 4 films a year, one art house, one comedy, one mythological, and one experimental fantasy. Critics would faint. Literally. But in Kerala, it's routine. Here lies Malayalam cinema's most fascinating paradox. It celebrates both its intellectual side and its mass craving. You can have Drishyam 2 and Jallikattu coexisting. Puli Murugan and Imayu released within years of each other. Both hits in their own way. One uses CGI tiger and other uses death as metaphor. And somehow the audience loves both. This coexistence is not confusion, it's maturity. Malayalam cinema learned that art and commerce aren't enemies. They are twin siblings bickering at the dinner table. While that chaos was unfolding, Puli Murugan emerged as the ultimate reminder that Malayalam cinema could still play the mass game, only smarter. It was the crowd pleaser, yes, but built on discipline and authenticity rather than formulaic bluster. The global appeal of films like Kumbalangi Nights or Mahisinte Pratikaram lies in how local they are. The stories are deeply rooted in Malayali soil, yet universally relatable. A film set in a teddy soft feels more global than some international project shot in fake New York sets. That's the beauty of this era. The more honestly local it gets, the more globally it resonates. Each film seemed to talk to the next, building a conversation across genres. One said, "We can do mass," another said, "We can do madness," and third whispered, "We can do meaning." Chapter 6 The Gender of Revolution. Some revolutions don't announce themselves with slogans. They slip in quietly, dressed like a lightning bolt. When Minnal Murli struck, it did not just electrify Kerala, it haywired expectations. A Malayalam superhero film made by the restless crowd that grew out of the new generation movement. And here's the kicker, produced by women. Nobody saw it coming. It was as if someone walked into the room and said, "What if our next social drama had capes?" And everyone actually agreed. And that too in a scenario where 2 years before the film released, nobody would have even remotely convinced by the idea of a Malayalam superhero. This film was the movement's most unexpected child. Funny, heartfelt, self-aware, and it broke through the pan-India audience. The way subtitles break through hesitations. Because it landed on digital platform at a time when everyone was home, scrolling and hungry for sincerity. That release was not just convenient, it was catalytic. For the very first time, a film born entirely from Kerala's creative soil went viral across linguistic border without shouting. And the aftershock of the success could be measured in data charts and dinner table debates. Viewership of Malayalam films across India spiked overnight. Suddenly, every cinephile from Vijayawada to Banaras was name-dropping Vineet Srinivasan and Lijo Jose Pellicetti, as if they had discovered them personally. That was the moment the new generation movement went from being a regional rebellion to national reference point. Minnal Murli proved that the movement was not a phase, it was an export. And then came Loka. If the Minnal Murli was the thunder, Loka is the storm that followed. A female-led superhero saga that folds Kerala's local myths and vampire folklore into futuristic cinema and somehow makes it all feel native, not borrowed. It is loud, weird, ambitious and unapologetically technical. A whole new benchmark in Indian cinema. Now in 2025, Malayalam cinema stands as the only industry in the world whose highest grossing film stars a woman superhero, born from its own folklore. No Western studio, no billion-dollar franchisee, just Kerala, a few frustrated news and technicians, and conviction. Both Minnal Murli and Loka are not outliers. They are the movement's proof of concept. The same directors, writers, editors, and sound magician who once filmed love stories in cramped apartments have now built universe from myth. Chapter 7, The Arrival of Loka and the Other Side of the Coin. And then came Loka. The first time I saw Loka, I realized it was not a movie. It was a culmination, a statement, a love letter to every experiment, every risk, every restless night of the new generation era. Technically, Loka is breathtaking. The sound design feels alive, the visuals fold into each other like stream collapsing. But beyond craft, what it represents is evolution. Loka is the byproduct of an industry that spent 15 years questioning itself. Without Big B, there would be no Loka. Without the new generation movement, there would be no audience willing to understand Loka. It is the film that says we can do anything. We have earned that freedom. Loka takes the introspection of Brahmayugam, the scale of Pulimurugan, the emotional depth of Drishyam, and the chaos of Jallikattu, and the courage of Minnal Murli. This is not a film industry showing off. This is an industry realizing what it has become. But every revolution has its contradictions. The new generation movement provides democracy to Malayalam cinema, but it also raised expectations. Audience now demand innovation every Friday. If a film feels even slightly ordinary, it is declared dead on arrival. There is also eternal tug of war, realism versus mass. For every Drishyam there is a Pulimurugan. For every Kumbalangi Nights an Avesam. For every Brahmayugam a Manjumal voice that bridges humor and heroism. I sometimes think of it as a balancing act on a rope, stretched between two palm trees. On one end stands art, on the other stands commerce. And Malayalam cinema is doing yoga in between. But this tension is healthy, it keeps the industry awake. Without it, we would drift into self-indulgence or formula again. If you ask me what Loka truly represents, it is this, synthesis. It is the meeting point of every idea the movement stood for. Experimentation, technical mastery, narrative courage, local imagination, everything. It shows what happens when an industry stops trying to prove itself and starts to explore itself. Watching Loka feels like watching Malayalam cinema gaze into a mirror, seeing every phase it survived, the Sakila years, the Big B spark, the flops, the experiments, the triumphs, and smiling back with calm confidence. It is not arrogance, it is self-knowledge. Chapter 8, Why it was needed. The movement was not a stylistic whim, it was a cultural necessity. Kerala's society was changing. Urbanization, migration, internet literacy, the world was shrinking and the audience grown smarter. They had access to Scorsese, Kurshaw and Bong Joon-ho at the click of a button. You could no longer sell them exaggerated morality tales. They wanted something real, something that reflected the contradictions of their lives. So the new generation movement was not just about new filmmakers, it was about a new audience, one that demanded respect. That demand forced the industry to evolve faster than any other in the country. And I guess the fatigue that took over Kerala in 2000s has taken over every other industry now. When you look beyond Kerala, you can see the ripples spreading. Telugu cinema is now in its grand myth-making phase. Tamil cinema is rediscovering realism. Bollywood is caught between nostalgia and reinvention. But everyone quietly is watching Kerala. You can sense it. The way other industries have begun valuing strong writing, the sudden fascination with minimalism, the rise of small town stories in Hindi films. That is the set of this movement. Because the new generation movement taught India a lesson. You don't need to shout to be heard. A good story will always find its way, through subtitles, through algorithm or through hearts, but always. Conclusion, why Malayalam cinema is the creative brain of India. As I sit through another festival where people discuss another Malayalam movie, Loka, frame by frame, I cannot help but smile. Once upon a time, the same audience clapped for heroes who could catch the bullet with their teeth. Now they applaud for stories that make them think. While other industries chase spectacle, Malayalam cinema chases truth. And truth, it turns out, is the most cinematic thing of all. That is evolution, not of technology, but of taste. This is an industry that survived moral fatigue, porn stigma, financial crisis, and cultural homogenization, only to rise as India's most innovative creative powerhouse. It's the cinematic equivalent of Phoenix, only the feathers are wet from rain and smell faintly of coconut oil. Mohanlal and Mammootty, now older statesmen, share screen space with directors young enough to be their children, and yet there is no ego war. It's a relay race, one generation passing the baton to another, and the finish lines keep shifting further ahead. It can make Avesam and Drishyam in the same decade and nobody blinks. It can have its biggest commercial success to be a superhero film led by a woman. It can turn a global disaster like the Kerala floods into a collective cinematic memory. As I watch films like Thudru or Brahmayugam, I realize what makes Malayalam cinema truly special. It doesn't scream for attention, it whispers, and you lean closer. What followed was the fire, the new generation movement that burned away the dust. reshaped the identity, and illuminated an entire creative culture. And Loka, that is the flame's reflection, proof that the fire still burns, the movement has not ended but evolved into thought, experimentation, and fearless storytelling. The rest of India might still debate box office numbers. Kerala, meanwhile, continues to write film, fail, laugh, and think like the brain it has always been.